Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and those of you just filing in and joining us. Happy to have you. I wanted to start today by letting you know that 15 years ago, it seems like just yesterday, but 15 years ago, I gave a series of lectures on the specific legal and constitutional history of free speech in America. And after I gave that series of lectures, I distilled those down to a single lecture which I delivered on dozens of college campuses across America. And the title of that lecture was The Looming Crisis Over Free Speech. Now, I tell you this not because I want to claim some sort of prophetic sense about what was going to happen, but I did note a couple of trends, and I think that there's something very interesting about what that tells us about the situation today. I certainly hoped that I was wrong. I hoped that there would not be a crisis over free speech. I hoped that we might get better at defending free speech, that the conditions for protecting freedom of speech would be more robust. I hoped, probably quixotically, optimistically, that I might be a small part in contributing to that better defense of free speech. But alas, I don't think that's what's actually happened. At the time, and still to this day, I remain steadfast in the belief that we have, around the world, not just in the United States, more effective freedom of speech than we have at any other time in history. What that means, in particular, is that we're able to speak in ways unimagined by previous generations. The problem is that we don't actually have a deeper understanding of why we should have freedom of speech. We don't have a more robust defense of free speech in the courts, in the legislatures. What we have is what the great scholar of the First Amendment, Eugene Volokh, has called being in an era of cheap speech. In other words, speaking is easier than it ever has been. In the past 20 years, there's been a proliferation of modes and means of speaking. I mean, just think about the different ways 20 years ago that you could have accessed an audience, that you could have spoken to people, and then think about the ways that you can do that today. We live today absolutely in more rich times. The abundance that we have today is unparalleled compared to even 20 or 30 years ago. And relatively speaking, the abundance we have in communication technologies, just think, 20 years ago, there was no iPhone, there were no Androids. I mean, even the 15 years ago when I gave this speech, the iPhone had only been out for 1 year. Imagine the transformation in communications technologies that have taken place since then. So in comparative terms, the quality and the dispersion of communication technology is vast. But the question is, these technologies that facilitate our speech, these technologies that have given us more ways of speaking than we ever have before, raise one very important question. What are the results of that? Right? Has that increase in our ability to speak and to reach audiences enhanced our flourishing, our freedom? Now, if you're a very careful observer, if you're really, really sensitive and observant, I mean, you might not have noticed this like I have, but I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It turns out a lot of people really don't like what other people are saying, okay? This facilitation of communications technology has not led to some sort of boon in peace, love, and harmony. Instead, there are a lot of people who are incredibly upset and action-oriented about changing this situation. Indeed, it's as if there was a great detective novel that has been grafted onto our public discourse in the form of a threatening regulatory agenda. There are people who want to regulate what you say, where you say it, why you say it, to whom you say it, when you say it, how you say it, and most of all, whether or not you can say it. Not just in person, not just online, but across all domains of communication. This is the problem. The problem is that at the very time that we have increased our ability to speak, functionally, effectively, we have also put at risk the very defense of that right to speak, our free speech. One doesn't need to look far to find evidence of this. Not just in America, but around the world. Left and right, Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals are all calling for more restrictions on speech of a variety of forms, right? They say there's a misinformation problem. On college campuses across America and around the world, students regularly attend controversial speakers in order to heckle, shout down, and in some cases physically intimidate and even attack people who have speech that they don't like. One need not remember Theo van Gogh or the Gillen's Poston and the Charlie Hebdos of the world, right? One only needs to think of someone like Salman Rushdie, who just faced an assassination attempt for a book that he wrote over 20 years ago. Free speech is under direct attack. Think of the confusions. It's not even just the people who want to attack it. Think about the confusions. Is it an artifact of free speech that you can be fired for something that you say, even if it's off the job? Is it consonant with your freedom of speech for someone, for example, to cancel you? What exactly does that mean, to be canceled? Can you be fired? Can you have a right to speak? Can you transmit your ideas whether people want to carry those ideas or not? There's enormous confusion around this topic. What about speech that harms? What does that even mean? How do we know what a harm is that's actionable, that we should be concerned about? And what is it just people being a little bit soft, right? And not having a thick skin? Should we expect people to have a thick skin? All of these questions ultimately come down to the problem today, that crisis that I suppose in some ways I predicted. So there's something very paradoxical about the last 15 or 20 years. This increase in speaking and ability to speak, and this decrease in understanding and increasing attack on the right to speak. The robust, principled, and uncompromising defense of free speech is somewhat missing today. This is what we need to recapture. This is what we need to find. Key questions remain. They're unanswered. Key values are unrealized. Key concepts are misunderstood. So if you haven't guessed it so far, I'm hoping to convince you that there is, in fact, a case, a principled, uncompromising, robust case for free speech, to do some of the vitally important work of helping all of us understand better our right to free speech. We need to get clear about some of those concepts. We need to make sure that we make, as the title of this lecture says, those life and death distinctions, and make them correctly in order for us to better enjoy our freedom. Now, the broader case for freedom is also deeply tied to our right to free speech. Many of you today are advocates for various kinds of freedom. Some of you are interested in educational freedom. Some of you are interested in medical freedom. Some of you in economic freedom. There are all kinds of causes that we come together to advocate. But think of that end point, advocacy, to advance the case for free trade, to advance the case for the right to choose your medical care, advance the case for any freedom. You need to be able to communicate, uninhibited, uncontrolled. So the right to free speech and the protection of it is vitally important for all of those types of freedom. To paraphrase Walt Whitman, the liberty movement is large. It contains multitudes. To somewhat amend Walt Whitman, let's hope we don't contradict ourselves, right? What it means is that all of these various aspects of freedom, those who want our values to be protected, need also to take seriously the case of protecting free speech. To flourish and partake in the values, to exchange them, to have a community that embraces flourishing and does so with the solid protections of the law, we must understand this. You cannot advocate, you cannot change policy, you cannot develop new technologies, you cannot educate children, you cannot succeed at business, earn profit, you cannot share your values with others in this myriad of ways if we do not have free speech. The record of human history of societies that choose censorship and control is bleak, disgusting, and grim. Those societies that do not allow freedom, that control what people can say, ultimately want to control what people can think, which means they ultimately want to control what people can do, which ultimately means millions die. The freedom of speech is essential to a free society. Now, what are some of the consequences of these misunderstandings? What are some of the problems that we see? When concepts are muddled and unclear, when our values are unidentified, right? When the questions remain unanswered, What happens when we try to answer those questions? When people go out and find new conflicts, right? No one 30 years ago would have said, is there a censorship problem on social media? No one knew what social media was. But now we have to answer that question. We have to address that question. We have to have the terms, the concepts, the means to understand the issues and answer them properly, because if we don't, we might make mistakes, very fatal mistakes. What's worse is if we get them wrong, we give rise to an understanding of free speech that has contradictions. It makes it possible for people to claim to be defending freedom while advocating policies that undermine it. Just stop and think about that for a second. How warped, how odd for people to stand in the public discourse and say, I believe in freedom, but yet advocate something like increasing use of antitrust policy against technological companies, or advocate for something like public accommodations laws to be applied to Twitter, right? Why use the tools of the state, the ones that economists, free market thinkers have identified for decades, if not over a century, are undermining our economic freedom, and say, well, this is the way to solve our free speech problem? This is very, very dangerous. Yes, of course, there are those today, increasingly all too common, who openly advocate for eliminating freedom, who reject the case for open exchange of ideas, right? You have the Patrick Deneen's and the Adrian Vermeules of the NatCon movement. You have Cass Sunstein, Ibram Kendi, anybody else on the left, right? There's lots and lots of people in today's political debate who simply reject the idea of free speech. We don't have to go that far back to find Stanley Fish's book, which famously had the title, There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, comma, and it's a good thing too, right? And there are people who repeat that, who believe that. But what's more dangerous is that within the movement of people who want more freedom, who want to establish a free society, whether here in America or across the world, have confusions and often advocate or find themselves swayed by ideas that actually undermine these values. So these are the dangers. These are the problems if we don't get clear about this. Consider all of these proposals, as I said. Public accommodations law, right? The idea that a company builds a product that enhances people's lives by facilitating their communication, and the government's going to come in and say, you have to serve everyone equally, whether those people represent your values or not, whether those people want to say things that you think are part of the communicative environment or not, right? I want to run a website for people who love a particular soccer team. And a bunch of people who come on and they say, well, the public accommodations law says you have to host my comments on your soccer blog, right? Your football blog for those of you outside of the United States, right? I have my favorite football team and I want to have a discussion about it. I want to make posts about it. I want to have a communication about it. But somebody comes on and starts spouting political propaganda. Somebody comes on and starts advocating all kinds of, obscure policies. And I say, no, I'm going to delete that comment. But they say, no, you're not allowed to do that. Imagine an environment like that. Imagine when the weapon of antitrust, the weapon of competition policy, is used to break up successful companies because not enough people like the way that they choose what communication can happen on their platforms or not. And this is not people, for example, who consider themselves liberals or conservatives. There are libertarians who have argued for using things like common carrier law, right? The old 19th century and common law notion that if you run a railroad, you can't refuse any service because you're the one means, government sanctioned, to get from point A to point B. And so we ought to apply common carrier law to social media companies. Heck, let's do it to newspapers. Everybody should have a column in a newspaper. Why not? Let's just have the most freedom of speech possible. What could go wrong? Whose rights would we be violating? In essence, that's the point I want to make. The confusions that are abounding in today's debate are the problem. We need to get clear on these. For those of you who value freedom, and I think that's hopefully everyone in this room, a proper understanding and defense of free speech is essential, absolutely vital to promoting and living in any free society. Now, I want to make a quick aside about some of the context of the examples that I'm using. Not just because I'm an American and I study American history and I know a lot about America, a lot of the examples obviously are going to be drawn from the context of the United States. but I don't want that to forestall the idea that what I'm addressing here has deeper philosophic basis, that what I'm addressing here applies regardless of what society you live in. Anywhere that freedom has a claim, these principles apply. The uniqueness of the different legal traditions may change the particulars of this, right? It may change the way that it might be implemented in any particular political system, but the principles, the ideas, are what's important. Now, one of the most telling and I think revealing observations about the United States relative to the rest of the world that's made often by outsiders, but also frequently, all too frequently I think anymore, by insiders, is the idea that the United States has too much freedom of speech. Let that sink in for a second. There's too much freedom of speech in America. Now, I said freedom, not free, right? It's not that there's too much volume of speech. I can't hear anyone, there's too much speech. Right? You're all talking at the same time, I can't understand. They mean there's too much freedom. The muchness there, right, the too much, describes the extent, not the amount. Now, let me repeat that for emphasis. People regularly criticize America for having too much freedom of speech. How bizarre is that? What could that possibly mean? Imagine, for example, consider, try to formulate what you think that means in someone's mind when they say, America has too much freedom of speech. If I'm successful today, I hope to convince you that that perspective, that whole approach to the question of freedom is wrong. That's not even the way we should think about freedom. I hope to persuade you that such a formulation is tantamount to saying, you have too much health. You have an excess of vitality. You have too much intelligence. You have a surplus of wealth, right? These are not things that we think of as saying there's too much freedom. Now, let's take it, I'm going to have a lot more to say about freedom and the ways that it's understood and the way that we can contextualize it. But let's take for a moment, just at face value, what that observation seems to suggest about the notion of freedom. First, saying that America has too much freedom of speech seems to suggest that freedom is bundled together with other values, other considerations, against which it has to be balanced. Any perspective might say, well, we have to have enough freedom but not too much freedom. What are the other values that are in competition with this? How could we have too much freedom of speech? What is the opposite? What are we lacking? Not enough order? Not enough control? Not enough censorship? What is it that we're balancing freedom with? What is this perspective actually suggesting? I think what it suggests is that the type of freedom that they're envisioning is a freedom that is inherently chaotic, uncontrolled, unwieldy, unstable, but fundamentally they think of freedom as something that can be value-destroying, not value-enhancing. This is the wrong perspective on freedom. The idea that freedom somehow can destroy our values is a deeply revealing perspective on human nature, about what kinds of creatures we are, that suggests that freedom somehow is not the appropriate state of our being. A second obvious face value implication of this idea that there's too much freedom in America is that freedom is not a state or a condition of our being, but rather that it's a gradual, granular thing that can exist in degrees, that there's like a master bureaucrat somewhere in a back room charged with the exercise of turning the dials. Exactly how much freedom can this society tolerate, right? The needs and uses of this society, the conditions of this society describe different variables that we can adjust the levels of freedom. And now, obviously, by my sarcasm, I hope you can tell that I disagree with this perspective, but even if it were true, I'd want to be like Nigel from Spinal Tap. I'd want my amp of freedom to go up to 11, right? Like, I don't want anybody playing with those levels of freedom. I want all the freedom. Now, obviously, as I said, I disagree with this. Freedom, in a very important sense, in a very meaningful sense, is not degrees. It's a condition, it's a state, it's an either-or. There's a very important either-or context to the idea of freedom. Either I can choose and direct my own actions, or I ask for permission. Either I have the autonomy to decide for myself how to direct my life, or someone else does. I am subject to the will of another. That's what it means. It's this either-or perspective that ultimately rests on the idea of individual sovereignty, autonomy, the right to do what you want with your life, your choices, your actions in a social context. That's what freedom means. You have it or you don't. Now, I don't want to suggest that there's never a context in which it's appropriate to talk about degrees of freedom. There are. I can think of two very easily. There's one context in which we describe reality in such a way, and there's another context in which we more analytically use that idea of degrees of freedom. Now, the reality-based one is very easy. We can all think of children, right? Developmentally, children are not entering the world with a capacity to choose and direct their actions responsibly and appropriately in the world. So, as they develop and we observe their rationality and autonomy developing, as parents, as society, we gradually recognize that there are different degrees of freedom that we allow them. But there is a threshold point. There's a threshold point where we recognize that as a human being, they have autonomy, barring exceptions and edge cases. They get to choose for themselves, right? Now, the other case is analytically. It's often said, for example, is one country more free than another? Is there more freedom in Brazil or in Germany? Is North Korea less free than Russia or vice versa? Right? Is the United States more free than Australia? Right? We can use this comparative sense and say that there are degrees. We can rank the level of freedom. I've done this myself in a context of the United States. Different states, what level of freedom is there? Right? And we can even do this chronologically. We can say, was there more freedom in the past? Was the United States more free in 1983 than it is in 2023? Or in 1923? Or in 1823? And we can do this as well in the different types of freedom. We can say that there's more economic freedom in one place and less religious freedom in another place. We can say that there's more political freedom in one place but less personal freedom in another place, or even within the same country over different times. But all of that analysis ultimately is checked by the fact that freedom is a unity, it's a whole. In the long run, you cannot have one aspect of freedom without the others, right? Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, dozens of other writers have identified this principle. Freedom is a whole. You cannot implement freedom in parts. Because if you do, you find very quickly that the parts that aren't free start to cannibalize and take over the parts that are free. You can only be going in one direction or another. You can be getting more free and more consistent with freedom, or you're moving away from that. So even though we can do this analytically, it's important to realize this either-or quality of freedom. Now, to frame the issue, this problem that we have today with free speech, there's an interrelated set of conditions that give rise to why we have this problem. What is it that's going on? Why is this the state of things? So with that proviso that I made earlier about the context of the United States, I want to say that there are two related historical reasons. One is specific, which I'll talk about in the United States, but one is more general, more historically broad throughout the Western tradition. And then there are three, I think, conceptual issues that are tied to those historical issues, but that are also very important for understanding these distinctions, these concepts, these values that we need to get clear on in order to understand the freedom of speech. Now, the historical reasons are two-part. The first historical reason, the specific historical reason, is that in the United States, the place where, after all, critics say we have too much freedom of speech, our Supreme Court and our Constitution has been muddled throughout its history in its protections of free speech. Across the first century of the adoption of the Constitution, there was not a single case construing the First Amendment of the Constitution. Now, there's lots of historical reasons for this. The artifact of it saying Congress shall make no law, and mostly a lot of the suppression, the censorship, et cetera, that was taking place over cases of obscenity, blasphemy, all sorts of other things was taking place at the state level. And so the Supreme Court at the time didn't consider that it could construe the First Amendment against the states. It took Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment, and a whole constitutional revolution for that to happen. But once it started happening in the early 20th century, at the advent of the 20th century, with the progressive pragmatist philosophers that had taught the legal scholars and ultimately the Supreme Court justices that were the first to construe this, it was a mess. The Supreme Court throughout the 20th century, as it gradually added more and more pieces to its First Amendment jurisprudence, was making more and more a mess of its understanding of what that meant. And I want to quote for you just one case today. And it's a curious sort of case. It's something of an orphan of a Supreme Court case in the United States. In other words, it's a case that set down doctrine on a particular question that has never been relied upon. The court has never made another ruling on this very specific question in free speech, even though it takes place at the states and other people. The Supreme Court has basically left this one alone. They made the decision and that was it. And the doctrine that they were trying to construe was the doctrine, for you fans of old cartoons, the Yosemite Sam doctrine. It's the doctrine of fighting words. What are fighting words? So in 1942, a man by the name of Chaplinsky, who was a Jehovah's Witness, was arrested for engaging in what was called fighting words. He called the town marshal some names. He called him a racketeer and a fascist. Remember, it's 1942, so those are really bad things. I get called that on a regular basis, I think. Fascist, like, oh no, I'm a fascist. But he was arrested and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Justice Frank Murphy, for a unanimous court, ruled that his conviction for using these fighting words, and by the way, the whole context, he was out proselytizing, he was a Jehovah's Witness, he was proselytizing in a Catholic town. For those of you who know the history of American religion, you know this is going to be a hotbed situation. He was being attacked by a local mob. He was being assaulted by a local mob. The town marshal came and told him, it's probably best if you leave. And he said, no, I've got a right to speak. It's a public street. Town marshal left. Another police officer came up. Well, by the way, the mob was trying to force him to salute the American flag, which Jehovah's Witnesses didn't believe was a thing. They thought it was idolatry to do that. And they were trying to poke him with a flagpole. They were doing all kinds of nasty things. And a policeman started taking him away and said, I'm worried about your safety. The town marshal was coming back to the scene, at which point he called him these names, and they arrested him. Not for speaking, not for inciting a mob, but for calling the town marshal some names, because those were fighting words. And as Justice Murphy said in this case, in his opinion, quote, "It is well understood that the right of free speech is not absolute at all times and under all circumstances. There are certain well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise any constitutional problem. These include the lewd and obscene, the profane, the libelous, and the insulting or fighting words, those which by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. It has been well observed that such utterances are no essential part of any exposition of ideas, and are of such slight social value as a step to truth, that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality." And then quoting another case, he said, resort to epithets or personal abuse is not in any proper sense communication or information or opinion safeguarded by the Constitution. Its punishment as a criminal matter would raise no question under that instrument. Now imagine, and that's the end of the quote. Imagine for a moment the idea that in 1942 that you could declare that things that were lewd and obscene were well defined, right? Tell me what you think obscene is. The Supreme Court spent another 30 years groping in the dark, sorry, bad pun, trying to figure out, that was unintentional, I promise, trying to figure out what obscenity was. At one point, Justice Brennan threw up his hands and said, I can't define it. Right? Justice Potter Stewart famously said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Right? They had a heck of a time trying to define what obscenity was, and ultimately threw up their arms and said, most of them, we can't do it. Despite the fact that they still said it was proper for states and the federal government to interdict against such things. What's lewd? What's profane? All of these categories. What's fighting words? What are the words that are so inflammatory that they provoke a person to lose all reason and just punch you in the face? Right? What response, and believe me, this is a real issue. There are still states in the United States where, as a civil crime of assault, right, a civil action for assault can be mitigated by provocation. He said something nasty to me. So I get to punch him in the face with less damages. Now, this is a very, very strange notion of reason and speech and how human beings should behave in a civilized society. But what I want to highlight here in this quotation is the idea that there are non-absolutes and that there are well-classified exceptions to free speech. And finally, that the justification that Justice Murphy in the court for dozens of years afterwards offered for free speech is that it was a step to truth and part of political process. These are key concepts that we're going to come in on today. Now, the other broader, more general historical reason why we're in, so that's a mess. I mean, just don't take my word for it, by the way. I pulled out a few quotations. This is really something. If you think that I'm exaggerating, let me quote for you some scholars. Susan Williams, law professor at Indiana, says, quote, "The doctrinal web surrounding the speech clause of the First Amendment is one of the most complicated, confusing areas in constitutional law." Erwin Chemerinsky, right, who's the dean of the University of California, Berkeley Law School. Simply put, it is not possible to comprehensively flowchart the First Amendment as a defined series of questions in a required sequential order. Or William von Alstyne, one of the great scholars of the First Amendment in the 20th century, noted, "Deriving a consistent theory of the First Amendment in the United States from the myriad of opinions of the Supreme Court represents a task similar to defining the inside and the outside of a Mobius strip. That which appears logical at one point evaporates from another perspective." Even Justice Elena Kagan, now on the Supreme Court, before she was appointed to the Supreme Court, noted that the technical, complex, classificatory schemes of the First Amendment have become only more intricate as categories have multiplied, distinctions have grown increasingly fine, and exceptions flourished and have become categories of their own. That's a mess. That is not the rule of law. That is something where you can go out into public and you're not sure ahead of time whether what you're going to say is going to be classified as something that's, quote, protected or unprotected speech, a false category, as we'll see. Now, the broader historical reason, as I said, goes all the way back to the origins of what we think of as the roots of free speech. And Jacob Mishangama's book on this, Free Speech, A History, is a great, great elucidation of the long history of this. But there are two Greek concepts that arose in democratic Athens. Right? Remember the place that put Socrates to death for speaking, possibly for advocating sedition. We're not, it's a little bit unclear. But democratic Athens had these two concepts, isagoria and parasia. Isagoria simply meant equal speech. It meant that in the Athenian assembly, everyone had equal speech. Everyone could be heard, every citizen, of course, right? Not, mind you, the women, the slaves, the medics, Aristotle, the people who weren't citizens. The citizens could speak, all of them equally. And in some phases of this development, there was a belief that all equally could speak so that no one could be denied. Not just that everyone had an equal right, because of course the concept of rights was not fully developed at that point, but that everyone could speak. No one could deny speech. But then they also had this concept of parasia, which meant unfiltered speech, essentially. It meant bold speech. It was what Aristophanes did when he made fun of some of the public figures of Athens. It's what the playwrights did. It's what the poets did. They spoke boldly, right? Or as they say in the modern sense, they spoke truth to power, right? They said unfilteredly what they wanted to. It sounds a little bit more like what people criticize the United States for. But both of these concepts always worked in tension. And that tradition of balancing the idea of equality of speech and unfilteredness of speech, and somehow balancing those, the difference between those, worked its way throughout Western history, where there's a tradition in many of the countries that have inherited the Greek and the Roman law, the ideas that are presented by these as being somehow in conflict. Now, the three conceptual reasons that I want to highlight, the three conceptual problems that got us to where we are today, and also that with clarity will help us get out of the problem that we face today, are number one, the justification for free speech, as I highlighted with that Supreme Court decision. Number two, the idea of freedom. What is freedom? What is freedom really about? How does it work? What are its contours? What counts as an exception, or what is an exception? Is that even a thing, et cetera? And then finally, the most important, I think, is an epistemological reason, a misunderstanding, or many misunderstandings of the nature of human reason. So the first of these, the misunderstanding of the political justification for freedom of speech. Traditionally, there have been, I would say, today, three major ideas about why free speech should be justified. all of them problematic. Number one, as I said, as part of the American tradition and many other places, there's the idea that the democratic political process requires free speech. Citizens need to be able to address political topics. They need to hear about public issues. They need to hear about what's being decided upon by their legislatures in order to effectively self-govern. Right? In order to participate in politics, you need to be able to speak about politics. You need to be able to participate. And this goes all the way back to the founding in the United States, going all the way back to the original Alien and Sedition Acts, one of the first times that the federal government tried to restrict speech, just some dozen years after the adoption of the Constitution, not even a dozen years. The idea was that in order to self-govern, everybody needs a chance to speak. The problem with this justification for free speech is that it's very, very limited, number one, to the idea of political speech, right? Your speech about your crazy theories of religion, your speech about your crazy theories about sexuality, your speech about your crazy theories about art, about any topic outside of politics that's not a matter of public debate, can be censored, can be suppressed, right? Because we have to keep order. We have to have consonant society that has a nice flow to it. Your crazy ideas, you know, Mr. Edison, Mr. Wright, you know, any inventor, anybody who comes up with a new idea, your crazy ideas aren't wanted here. So that's a problem with that justification, is that it limits it to politics. And so if you don't speak about politics, well, we can suppress you, because after all, that's what democratic self-government does. It suppresses people who say things we don't like. Just ask Socrates and many other people who are banished or sentenced to execution by a democratic mob. The second justification, probably the one most familiar to everyone in the room, is the consequentialist or the utilitarian justification. This derives from John Stuart Mill's famous book On Liberty, 1859. The idea is that free speech is a value because it leads to all kinds of other good things. It leads to more informed citizens. It leads to the reach for truth. It leads to social justice. It leads to all kinds of other things in society. Free speech is instrumental to these things. In other words, free speech helps us arrive at the truth. This is Justice Holmes's idea, the marketplace of ideas. This is how we get to truth. Now, the problem with this approach to justifying free speech is at the very heart of what it means to be an instrumentalist theory. It means that it's not a top value. Your freedom to speak is great as long as it contributes to these other values that society chooses, democratically, majoritarianly, right? Your free speech is great as long as it contributes to this. But if you say something a little too controversial, too outside the mainstream, something that someone else designates as hate speech, right? Whatever bounds that category has. Someone then that designates what you say as obscene, as profane. Well, then you can be censored, because after all, that doesn't reach the truth. Now, Mill himself was very, very loath to embrace the idea of censorship. He was more worried, actually, as he said, about social censorship. But his idea of an instrumental value to free speech means that he didn't see speech as a right. He saw it as something that the government granted for certain purposes so long as it achieved certain values. But that's not the nature of an individual right. An individual right is not something that you get as long as the government thinks that you're doing it right. It's an individual right is something that the government is prohibited from acting on. It's something that you claim against the government, whether or not the government likes what you're doing with it, barring criminal action and rights-violating action, right? If you use your freedom of action to do backflips, or tumbling, or tightrope walking, and they declare that, as some places in the 19th century United States did, as performing unbearable feats of human dexterity, distracting people from their work and their church services, they could ban that, right? All kinds of reasons that they can ban things if they don't consider them a right. Now, the last reason, and again, this is a newer reason, is the justification of free speech on the basis of skepticism. Not necessarily the philosophic school of skepticism, but skepticism about truth. Right? This is a kind of very postmodern justification for free speech. Since we're all just stumbling around, unable to reach truth through human reason, since it is fundamentally inaccessible to us, why in the world would we trust other people to be the arbiters of truth? Let free speech reign, because after all, we're all just fools with no idea what the truth is. If we trust you or you to censor our speech, you're just as fallible and unable to reach the truth as we are. We need to live in a society that has free speech, because after all, truth isn't a thing. You don't need to think very long and hard about why this is going to ultimately undermine speech. After all, it's going to be a clash of wills. If my speech offends you, if your speech offends me, and none of us believe in truth, what stops you or stops me from suppressing each other? What stops me from saying, well, that's not speech. That's, some other attack on a value that I have. And after all, you can't claim any truth claim that this is a wrong thing. Wrong? What's this wrong you're talking about? Bash you over the head, throw you in jail. If you're skeptical about the very idea of truth, you don't have a very robust idea of rights. So there are these bad justifications. Now, to give some context and to illustrate in brief, because it would take a much more elaborate discussion about the nature of rights themselves, the right to free speech, the reason why we have a right to free speech, is a recognition of our inherent individual rights, of our rights as reasoning beings, right? It is not because there are good consequences, although there are. It is not because political society is more workable when we have free speech, although it is. The reason why we have free speech is a recognition of our right to liberty, our right to direct our actions, ultimately our right to life. Human beings are reasoning creatures. Human beings live, survive, and flourish through the application of reason, thought, to the problem of survival. From its very base at just getting food, shelter, and clothing, to the highest reaches of designing, materials for rapid communication around the world, for solving all kinds of problems that we didn't even know we had. All of that application of reason takes place through thought. And thought is an abstract thing. The right to implement that thought into reality is why we protect free speech. Because your thought, the embodiment of your thought, is speech, writing, publishing, embodying your ideas in reality, not just in your head, but in reality, is speaking. And that speaking, that writing, allows you to communicate those ideas to other people and allows you to hear the ideas of other people. It's a two-way street. The freedom of speech, as Ayn Rand noted, means the freedom from interference, suppression, or punitive action by the government. You have the right to say things, to communicate things. But the problem is that freedom is often misunderstood. Freedom of speech means the right to express one's ideas, in whatever form that might be, print, speaking to you as an audience, etc. The form of suppressing the speech only can come from the government in a free society. Government is the only institution that has the capacity to compel you not to speak or to compel you, punish you for speaking the wrong thing. I can turn off my ears, I can walk out of this room, I can do all kinds of things that effectively stop your ability to communicate to me. I can block you, right? I can do whatever I do on whatever form I do, but that doesn't stop you from speaking. It may stop you from having me as an audience or other people as an audience. And if I run a business and I say, you can't speak, even though I have a public forum, right? It's not the public doesn't own it, I own it. But even though I open it up to speakers, doesn't mean I have to open it up to you. I get to choose. It's my right? It's my property. Freedom is often misunderstood in this context. Speech, being the means by which individuals can communicate, does not guarantee communication. It is not truly a segoria. It's not truly an equal right to speak. It's an equal right to attempt, to earn the means, to earn the power, to be able to speak because of how you have commanded an audience through your appeal to that audience. It is not a right to a megaphone. It is not a right to a newspaper column. Freedom does not mean ability. It means freedom from interference. Right? Think of this context. I am not able to speak French. Je ne parle pas français. Really, I don't. Okay? But I'm free to learn how to speak French. There's a big difference. I have the capacity, but I don't have the capacity right now, but I have the freedom to attain the capacity. In this whole talk of exceptions, I really want to emphasize this. The traditional discussion around free speech suggests that there is freedom of speech with exceptions. For example, defamation, true threats of violence, inciting a riot, disclosing protected government secrets. These are outlawed. These are exceptions to free speech. Fighting words, obscenity, all the other things of the classic characteristics. But this is wrong. Consider, for example, outlawing of these things as exceptions is like saying that laws against theft and rape and murder are exceptions to your freedom of movement, or that your right to acquire, use, and dispose private property in the form of, say, a baseball bat has an exception that you can't smash another person's car windows with it. These are not exceptions. These are not carve-outs from your rights. These are the means of protecting your rights. The prohibition of murder and the prohibition of using speech to violate rights is a means of protecting those rights, not an exception to those rights. Using the language of exceptions, of non-absolute freedoms or non-absolute rights, is exactly the means by that wedge, by which that wedge gets into the legal defense of free speech. The exceptions argument is simply wrong. You can have freedom of action, but not have capacity, versus have freedom of action and be held down by a government agent or be imprisoned, right? You may not have the muscular capacity to have certain movement, but you're not unfree. You're unfree if someone's literally holding you down. Now, when we acknowledge that there are ways that actions can violate, that speech actions, that the ways that people speak can violate rights, that's a very sensitive and delicate issue for the philosophy of law, to carve out exactly when is it that you're actually inciting a riot? When is it that defamation causes damages? When is it, et cetera, et cetera? But I want to note that this is something that it only is going to work if you have the proper understanding of what a right is. If you start with the idea that you can make exceptions to rights, you're never going to get to the right answer about when a particular exercise of property, speech, et cetera, might violate rights. You won't have a free society. Now, before I wrap up, I want to make one special observation. There's a lot of discussion today. This is a very hot issue, and I probably could have talked the whole time about this issue. There's a very hot issue about what happens when government seems to compel private actors to censor our speech, right? If Mark Zuckerberg doesn't like what I say anymore and he kicks me off of his product, Facebook, or Instagram, or if Sunday Pichai, kicks me off of YouTube, or whatever it is, right? Or Elon gets really mad at me and kicks me off of Twitter, I don't know. Is that censorship? Is that a limitation of my freedom? Is it a contractual right? Is it a constitutional right? Well, there's actually a whole developed theory of law about what happens when the government attempts to use its powers indirectly by compelling private actors to achieve its ends. In the case of speech, it's a funny word, it's called jawboning. It comes from the idea of Solomon, I think, is it Solomon? Yeah, that says that he can slay thousands with the jawbone of an ass or a donkey, right? Jawboning is basically if I'm a government official and I tell you to do something and I threaten you, right? Oh, it's a nice business you have there. It'd be a shame if I increased your tax rates. Or, hey, it's a nice business you have there. It's too bad if I compel the credit card agencies no longer to accept your transactions, right? Or et cetera, et cetera. Now, the question about this, and the question about whether this was happening with Twitter, whether it's happening with Facebook, YouTube, et cetera, I find difficult. Not because I don't think that it's wrong for government to use third parties, private third parties, to achieve some kind of censorship goal, but because I'm not entirely convinced that that's what's happening, right? I watched for years as Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and others went to Washington, not to be chided, but to beg for new regulations, right? I know people that work at these companies. Many of them probably happily censored what they considered to be COVID misinformation or Ukraine disinformation or whatever they call it. I'm not entirely convinced that they were acting unwillingly. In order to have an actual problem, we need to see that the government is in fact coercing this third party into doing what it's doing. So that's one problem. But the other problem that I see in the debate today is that if you imagine for a moment that the government is abusing someone's rights, right, the free speech rights of a private company to host or not host content that it wants to, and your solution to that problem is to punish the victim by saying we're going to break up your company, or we're going to regulate you, or we're going to force you to do something, rather than punishing the government, rather than making a law that says that the government, any government agent that reaches out and attempts to jawbone, attempts to censor a private citizen through third-party means, will be fined, will be imprisoned, et cetera. The problem is government, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is not the tech companies. The tech companies in that scenario are the victims. Now, they may be willing, complicit. They may have even set up the regulatory environment by which they can become victims. But the solution to this is not to continue to expand the growth of government and its power over our freedom of speech. The solution to this is as in every case, to roll back government power to its legitimate, proper functions. So, the epistemological case. Just think about this. What sort of picture of reasoning human creatures does the censorship argument think of, the too much free speech argument? The free speech is dangerous. It's going to undermine our values. It assumes, for example, that the volume of speech equates to the persuasiveness of speech. Right? By volume, I mean the amount, not the literal volume, right? Not the loudness of it, although maybe you can make that argument as well. Right? The more I shout at you at a very loud voice, the more persuasive I am. I've met people like this. It's not actually true, and the amount isn't true. I don't care if there are 1 million people on Facebook saying something. It doesn't make anyone believe it. Right? Beliefs form properly, true beliefs, beliefs that can actually count as beliefs, when people evaluate evidence, integrate that evidence with their present knowledge, reduce those concepts back to the perceptual level, figure out and evaluate on their own. It's an individual process. After all, I mean, how many of you automatically believe the faith that might have been the most frequently one told to you as you were growing up? Right? You're all religious adherents of what you heard the most, right? If you've been proselytized more by Catholics than Protestants, well, you're obviously a Catholic. No, you can be an atheist. You can make up your mind for yourself. The volume of speech does not equate to persuasiveness. Mere communication does not produce belief. Have you ever tried to persuade someone? Have you ever tried to convince someone to give up a belief and accept your belief? This is not an easy thing. If mere communication, fancy Facebook memes could do this, well, we'd have a very different world today, right? We would have a world in which people weren't reasoning creatures. Now, one reasonable concern. The change in the information landscape with the advent of technology has led many people to think that a lot of us are ill-equipped to deal with the new methodological problems that are raised by this environment, to cope with the amount of falsehoods, disinformation, deception, etc. But the solution to this, of course, is not to simply give elites more power to discern for us what is true. The solution to this is to educate, to help people overcome these conceptual illusions in the way that we help children overcome perceptual illusions, right? We don't worry when a child thinks that a stick bends in water. We explain to that child why the bending of the light waves makes it appear that that stick is bent, right? In the same way, if we want to help people overcome the problem of this kind of speech environment that's developed, we don't simply have government tell them what's true, because that belief in them wouldn't be an authentic belief anyway. They wouldn't be considering the facts. They wouldn't be evaluating the truth claims. We help them with that process. So, the first thing that we need to do, the positive points from today's lecture, we need to begin by acknowledging that we are, in fact, living in a wondrous technological age in which the spread of ideas has developed unprecedented velocity. We stand like a modern Gutenberg, witnessing the transformation of the communication of ideas in our world. But unlike solitary individuals developing technologies, millions have been working to create the means and the power to communicate these ideas. And we ought to celebrate that. We ought to revere them. They are an integral part of developing the case for freedom, of implementing new ways of speaking to help us defend and solidify our freedoms. We owe it to them to celebrate those things. The Gutenbergs who work on movable type, the inventors who make iPhones that allow us to communicate, all of the pieces in between. We should say, like, for those of you who've read Atlas Shrugged, we should say, well done, Mrs. Taggart, right? Because justice demands as much recognizing and celebrating the people who achieve as it does denouncing and condemning the evil. Now, the last point I want to make is for us to remember that the answer to these supposed dilemmas of free speech is there. There is a robust, consistent, principled case for the proper understanding of free speech. As I've indicated, it rests on the wider case for defending individual rights, of limited government. It is articulated in the works of Ayn Rand and dozens of others. We can learn from this. We can study this. We can spread these ideas far and wide. And I hope that you'll join me in making this case for free speech, because it is a deeply enriching and enlivening, life-enhancing value that both contributes to and supports a rational culture. Our rationality requires interchange of ideas. We need to test, we need to practice, we need to use it. Life is motion. You don't just get a value or an idea and stand still. You got to do this over a lifetime. To do that, you need to continue to confront ideas, old, new, bad, good, ugly, beautiful, true, false. That's the practice of rationality. That's what free speech requires. That's what human beings require. If we're to have a robust exchange of ideas, if we're to have a culture that embraces this, that produces all of the glories of the technological world that we live in, we must embrace and understand and protect that right to free speech, not just as the means of our survival, but as the path to our flourishing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so I left less time for questions than I had hoped, but I will try to get through as many as I can, which means I hope that you have short questions. Old teacher me will cut you off if you're going too long. Yes, Nicholas.
Hey, I think it was Rand who said in the Nature of Government essay in Virtue of Selfishness that the rights-protecting, laissez-faire government she was talking about is one for a rational, civilized society. And so my question is, when you say making it illegal to club someone over the head is a protection, not an exception of the freedom of movement, is that because the rational, civilized man would never club someone over the head in the first place, and therefore that's why it's absolute?
No, the protection of those rights, the reason why any of the laws against the initiation of force remain objective and absolute has no regard for whether the individuals composing a society are all perfectly rational. It's in fact because we assume that they're not all perfectly rational, right? I mean, if I can borrow from James Madison, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If we were all perfectly rational and could guarantee that, if by some metaphysical joke we were not actually fallible, right, then we wouldn't need to have laws. It's precisely because there are people who might club you over the head that we need to implement those laws, and so therefore they're not that exception. Yes, over here.
So my question is about cheap speech and digital anonymity. There's a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle advocating that we need to ban this, and we all kind of know that people say things to each other online that they wouldn't say to each other in person. And so there's this idea, we need to get rid of this, but I always think of like Silence Dogood wanting to make a point that you wouldn't be politically acceptable. And in the same vein, I know people who say, I keep myself anonymous online because I don't want to be held responsible for what I have to say. And hear other people say, that's exactly the problem. You should be willing to put your name behind it.
Yeah,
so
yes. Yeah, so there is a very concerning issue here. I mean, it's a real issue, right? I mean, in a lot of these, I made light of certain exceptions, certain rules, different things that people have suggested about free speech. But anonymity is a genuine problem, right? Because let's just say that anonymous speech, like if we have robust protections for anonymity of speech in certain means, certain platforms, et cetera, that we start to edge closer to the opportunity for those people who can speak anonymously to do so in a way that violates rights. Not just in a way that hurts my feelings or in a way that, I wouldn't say that to you if I saw you in person versus if it's mediated by a screen, but in ways that are genuinely something that might be an actionable crime, et cetera, et cetera. Those are real issues, right? I don't think, though, in the same kind of way that I was talking about some of these other issues, that the solution is to eliminate anonymity. The solution is to develop means of understanding what those boundaries are, and then for the people who might facilitate, right, if you're a platform or if you're a means of amplifying speech, to develop an understanding of that, because my sense is that there aren't a lot of people who want to be responsible for that, right? Companies, I mean, this is why the tech companies want to have that, as people often say, that grant of liability, but it's rather a codification of the liability issues around speech. They don't want to have speech that violates rights, right? They want to be able to get rid of it. We need to have robust protections for that, as well as protections for anonymity. I haven't yet read it, but a scholar that I very, very much respect on this issue, on free speech, Jeff Kosef, who's written a lot about Section 230 and other areas of speech, actually has a book about anonymity and privacy in regard to free speech that I am anxious to get to. that I might recommend. I mean, based on his other work, I would recommend it. But it's a genuine issue because if that speech, that anonymous speech, is running aground of the rights protection, then there is something that needs to be done, right? Now, whether that is the government needs to come in and say, this is rights violating speech, and you, as a host of that speech, either need to shut it down or you face criminal penalty, in which case, of course, the incentive structure is aligned so that people don't have that, or some other solution. The solution, it stops short of saying no anonymous speech, right? I mean, and I think that is, at least in the United States, a well-recognized value. Publius, i.e. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Silence Dogood, i.e. Benjamin Franklin, they widely recognized that there was a value to anonymous speech. And I don't think that we need to get rid of that. I think we need to figure out what the boundaries are and to regulate it in the proper way. Yes, over here.
Hey, so last semester I wrote a paper regarding the spread of fake news and how they affect us in a negative way. And one of the contra arguments that I found was that actually by taking down the fake news, sometimes it can affect our freedom of speech. So specifically what I wanted to ask you is, what's your opinion regarding like those people who say that by taking down this, we are going to be affecting the way that people can express themselves, considering that sometimes even this fake news can propose like negative ways of seeing the things or also be harmful?
Yeah, no, so this is a very good question that I think highlights, and I'm glad you asked because it highlights a difference between what we talk about when we say a legal, constitutional, or institutional structure of free speech and what we talk about when we say a culture of free speech, okay? So in any of these cases, if the person taking it down is a private entity, if it's not the government that's compelling this action, if it's a Facebook or whatever, and they're not acting under compulsion by government, then of course it's their right. I mean, I was gonna ask the audience, like, think about 20 years ago and think about now. How many of you have blogs, have YouTube channels, have podcasts, have Substacks? I mean, raise your hand if you have some means of communicating with the world, right? And I probably have missed like, TikTok and 100 other ways that you do this. And there will be 100 new ways in the next, 5 years, right? There's a flourishing of ways to do this, but all of them are private, and all of them have the power to take you down, right? Because that ultimately, I believe that's their right. Now, is that a problem for free speech? I don't think so, because I think that what we want to articulate is that if the private censoriousness, if we want to call it that, although it's not actually censorship, but if the private willingness to tolerate a wide swath of speech is foreshortened, if people become less tolerant of new ideas, that's ultimately a cultural problem, not a legal problem. It's a legal problem if, in fact, the government is getting involved in that. If the government is threatening people with jail time, with fines, with shutting down their businesses, whatever it might be, if that is what's leading people, or threatening them with bad grades or expulsion or whatever it might be, if that's what's causing people to become less willing to hear that speech, then that's a government problem. Culturally, though, what we need to do is we need to focus on the fact that that rationality, that willingness to hear speech, that willingness to tolerate someone saying something crazy, the earth is flat, there's aliens on your shoulder, I don't know, whatever it might be, whatever crazy, or political crazy ideas, right? Artistically crazy ideas. That willingness to tolerate is part of the free speech culture more widely, and I think that is something that's much, much more rooted in the kinds of ways that we talk about ideas, that we interact with other people, that we promote the open discussion, right? Not shutting people down and shouting, et cetera, et cetera. But that really ultimately has nothing to do about freedom of speech because that's a political question. And so we need to be very careful to differentiate between what is a political legal issue and what is a cultural issue. Because you might have, I can imagine a society that has profound legal protections for free speech, but which is quite reserved and unwilling to talk about, I don't want to characterize any part of the world, but just imagine for yourselves, a culture where people are very reserved and quiet and they don't say crazy things can nevertheless have a very, very wide and open legal culture to protect speech, but they just never really push the boundaries. Or you can have a culture where they push a lot of boundaries, right? You can have a more open, robust, wild, misfit culture that has a lot of expression of those ideas. But the legal question is separate from that. And if we want to promote a society that allows that says, hey, sometimes the crazy ideas 20 years on are the ideas that help us improve our world, we got to listen to them, then that's a cultural issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So my question is about the idea of compelled speech, because you've talked a lot about the freedom to say things, but I'm thinking of like Bill C-16 and kind of enforced pronoun usage in Canada. Do you see this as kind of a converse issue, or do you see it as a completely different issue?
No, the freedom to speak and the freedom of speech is correlative to the idea of non-compelled speech, right? Now, I know something about the issue in the Canadian law, and I know something about how this works in the American law. What we need to be very careful with is the context and the enforcement mechanism when we say compelled speech. Because ultimately, that flip side of the freedom to speak is the same as the freedom not to speak. It's the same as the freedom to listen or not listen. It's the same as all of those sort of two-poled parts of the freedom of speech. Now, if you say that the government compels you to, as they had at some point, I mean, in the United States, if the government compels you to say the Pledge of Allegiance every day, right? And you say, I don't believe in that, can they punish you? Well, that's an obvious case of compelled speech. Can the government or can your employer say that at the beginning of every day we praise the company on pain of firing? Well, that's a different issue. So compelled speech, in those cases, we need to be very careful to differentiate between, is this the Canadian Parliament that's setting this law, or is this a private university administration? Those are very different cases. But compelled speech is absolutely a part of the case for freedom of speech. Saying that you can, imagine, for example, you have a complete freedom of speech, but somehow, I don't know, Elon, let's say, is able to give the government things that they can implant in your head that actually determines everything you say. Are you free? Well, no, obviously not. If they can at a cognitive level tell you what to say, you're not free, you're compelled, even though there's no filter on what you say. So it's important to recognize that your freedom of speech includes the freedom to just stay silent. But it ultimately is a government versus non-government question. Because, your company, if you're a member of a private association or whatever, they may say, yeah, this is part of the terms of joining. Either you say this or you're not part of our group, right? Okay, yes, over here.
First, thank you for this speech.
Sure.
Which expression should you use instead of exception in freedom of speech in case of, for example, info being expelled in a war scenario, a government info being...
Can you come a little bit closer to the mic? I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
In, for example, censorship of national security information during a war scenario,
Right.
Instead of exception of freedom of speech that doesn't exist, what should we use instead within our language?
Yeah, so I think that this is a good question. If you don't say, hey, you have freedom of speech except exceptions, or there's an exception to your freedom of speech, you can't say this or you can't say that. I think it's similar to the examples I used. I don't think we say that murder is an exception to my right to use a weapon, right? We say murder is a crime, and your right to use a weapon, or property is a right, and vandalism is a crime, right? We don't say that vandalism is an exception to your freedom of use of property. I think what we need to do is we need to be very clear and very deliberate about delineating the names of the crimes. Their speech, right? They're ways of using words that can violate rights, or violate agreements, or violate contracts, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to be very clear about naming those as crimes, and not saying that, well, you have the freedom to speak, because it implies that it somehow, in some world, it would be consonant with your freedom to be able to do those things, and that we just carve out exceptions because of the current circumstances. What we want to be sure to say is that your freedom to speak is absolute about those things that you can say that are not rights violating, in the same way that my freedom to swing my fist is absolute, but does not include, unprovokedly, unconsensually punching you in the face. And so I don't know if I have a one term, but I think that it's just important that we say, just like murder is a crime and using your knife to stab the air is your freedom, but once my body meets your knife, that's a crime, but it's not a limitation on your freedom of movement, right? That we just need to name the things for what they are.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Maybe two more questions, I think. Well, we'll see how quickly we get through them.
Good afternoon. Yeah. Sorry, the mic is a little bit
That's okay.
short.
I think I can hear you.
Right. I'd like to ask a question about the future of free speech. So basically, for everything that might have some government overreach in this world, has independent, non-government affiliated regulation bodies that regulates the government in a certain way. Now, you've talked about it's not big tech's fault, it's about government overreaching these big technology companies. So what are the efforts being made to regulate the government not to do such things in the United States? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So in the United States, so Robbie Soave at Reason wrote a really good article about this recently, I think in the last couple of issues of the magazine. called How the CDC Became the Speech Police. And he has some very good suggestions for how to think about limiting government actors. There's a thing in the United States called the Hatch Act, which prohibits certain electioneering activities by government officials. And he suggests that possibly we can have a similar act that prohibits or that regulates or that punishes government officials who engage in attempts to jawbone, to try to censor people by proxy. There's one trick, though, as he points out in his article, is that in the United States, members of Congress, who are the most notorious violators of this, have a constitutional protection called the Speech and Debate Clause, that when they are on the floor of Congress, when they're in a congressional session, they cannot be held liable for what they say. Okay, now, when Bernie Sanders writes a letter to Amazon and says, if you don't do this, I'm going to do this to your company, or we're going to do an investigation, or we're going to do that, that's outside of Congress. That's outside of his speech and debate protections. But what we need is we need some way of identifying what this looks like. When is it an implicit threat of force or threat of regulation or whatnot, and then creating a set of punishments, creating a set of regulations that actually hold government officials accountable to that policy. Because we want them to be able to say, hey, you know, I think that it would be a good idea if this law came into effect, but we want them not to be able to say, that's a real nice shop you had, it'd be a shame if anything happened to it, right? We don't want them to be the kind of mobsters that they act like. But we also want them to be able to express a range of policy possibilities that may include things that we think are rights violating, but so that we can advocate against those, so that we can get the actual debate out there and shut those ideas down and identify what's wrong with them. So in the United States, it's hard, because the people at the state level, at other levels, we can enact laws that say you're responsible if you do this thing that we declare to be an improper use of your office. With members of Congress who are, as I said, some of the worst offenders, it's tricky. But I hope that people are working toward ways of regulating that in the same way that we work to regulate their advocacy of electioneering when they're in official capacities, et cetera. I guess this will be the last question.
Yeah. Hi, Daniel. Nice talks. My name is João Ferreira. I am the founder of the largest student movement libertarian in Brazil, and apart from SFL2.
Yeah.
We are facing a serious problem in Brazil. Our Supreme Court censored the right side in the last year elections and didn't stop there. They impeached one of the most voted congressmen, Deltan Dallagnol. They are banning social media from anyone who questions something about the electoral process and all this without legal basis. So today we have the leadership of Congressman Marcel Van Hatten, but against these acts, it's yet a very difficult fight. So what do you think we young people in Brazil can do against this? Thank you.
Wow. That's a big question. I mean, I'm somewhat aware of the situation in Brazil, and actually a lot of what I've learned is from John Hersey, who obviously I know has traveled to Brazil and has written about this issue. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, I mean, he just had a baby. That's like a wonderful thing. He's not at the conference right now because he and his wife are new parents. But you know, one of the things that I'll say that I think I'm confident about, and one of the things I'll say that I honestly don't know because I just don't know enough about the context. The thing I'm confident about is that within the bounds of legality and within the bounds of what is available to you, it is absolutely essential for Brazilians who want freedom and who want to maintain freedom in Brazil to advocate for all the types of, for everything that the government might do, might constrain, might censor. Because the population, the people, understanding that issue and recognizing and being able to identify with people, you know, the kind of human element of it, of a characteristic individual who's silenced, or a popular person, or, you know, in the case of the Arab Spring, one, you know, person with a cart selling things who just says enough. That kind of power that can spark a movement is absolutely essential. And so what I'm confident about is that it's important for everyone there who continues to care about this, that you don't want to be the next Venezuela. You don't want to be the next country where people have to flee and say, I'm a Brazilian, but I live in blank because my country is no longer a free state, right? I've met hundreds of Venezuelans who say, oh, but I live in Colombia or I live in Brazil or whatever. You want to prevent that, and the way to prevent that is to continue to advocate for the right ideas. Now, the part I'm not confident about, because I don't know the context of Brazil, is the means politically by which, at the state level and then up to the federal level and so on, that you can find pockets of freedom that you can push up or push down into the various levels. Like, so for example, in the United States, our federal system, which I know Brazil has a similar but not, obviously not analogous system, we can find places where there's more and less freedom even on in the federal system state to state. And people can move places, or they can use those places as ways of advocating for better ideas that they don't feel as much threat of that kind of censorship or imprisonment or whatnot. I just don't know enough about Brazil to say one way or the other if that's a possibility. But if it is, I think that's something that is worth considering. In a kind of farthest looking perspective, if a country has, and because of the technology, it's possible, has an effective means of censoring the free discussion of ideas. If a country reaches the point where they truly no longer have freedom of speech, it becomes very hard to advocate for freedom from inside the country. I don't want to say, oh, you need to leave Brazil. I mean, it's a wonderful country. Why would I say that? I mean, it's a sad thing to contemplate that. And I don't know whether the context has reached that point. But if it ever does, this is the bulwark of liberty, right? I mean, James Madison, the other founders, recognized that without free speech, liberty has no hope. Because you can't discuss the right ideas, you can't advocate the right ideas. But to the extent that you still can advocate for freedom elsewhere, even if it's not on certain issues, you have to do so because the principle will apply. And people will start to identify with that. And that's what I think is most important. That's why I made the case today that it's not just about economic freedom or political freedom, it's about all of those freedoms. And when some of those become impossible to talk about, talk even more about the other ones. Because that spillover effect, I think, is inevitable if you make the right case for that freedom. And I wish you, all the best in continuing to do so, because it would be an enormous shame if Brazil continued to go, in the way towards censorship. All right, well, we're out of time. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.